Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you two really awesome guests involved in creating a better tomorrow for millions of people out there. And, we are on the eve right now of the 2024 Alzheimer's Association's International Conference occurring right around the corner here in Philadelphia, and are being joined by two guests from the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative on the show today, a really pioneering global initiative focused on curing Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, seeking to mirror the success of other major global moonshots, like some of the recent ones in the infectious disease space, such as COVID and malaria. First, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Tim MacLeod. He is director of the Systems Preparedness workstream at Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. There, he executes on their mission to facilitate the implementation of national, regional, and global commitments to future innovations in treatment, diagnosis, and care. And based on his background in this area, guides the development, the execution, the dissemination of these multi-site real-world studies to generate evidence about the various facilitators and barriers to adopting technologies in the Alzheimer's and related dementia space. Prior to the collaborative, Dr. MacLeod was leading the human-centered design studio Bridgeable as a managing director, working for various Fortune 500 companies in the financial services and health space. He holds a PhD in community psychology, published extensively on both health innovation and implementation sciences. We are also have the honor of being joined by Dr. Vaibhav Narayan, Executive Vice President of the Collaborative. He joined after about 14 years at J&J. There he was Vice President of Digital Health Innovation, Head of Data Science for Neuroscience R&D, and created and led various programs focused on sort of the genomics to digital revolution, understanding various subtypes of disease, developing artificial intelligence and machine learning tools for digital health solutions, prevention, early detection. Prior to that, he headed discovery informatics at Eli Lilly, as well as he was a director of computational sciences at Celera during the heyday of the Human Genome Project. We're honored to have them both with us today. Dr. Narayan also, he did his PhD at Yale in computational biology and an executive MBA at Kellogg School of Management. Again, honored to have them both. Dr. Tim MacLeod and Dr. Vaibhav Narayan, thank you so much for coming on the show at this important time.
Thanks so much for having us, Ira. We're thrilled to be here.
Likewise.
Yeah, great having both of you. And again, it's exciting to see what's going to be happening this year at the conference here in Philly. Would love to start things off as we typically do by handing the floor to both of you for a little bit, just to talk a little bit more about you and your backgrounds, because you both come at this from slightly different angles. Tim, I'd love to start off with you. You did your PhD in the area of this interesting program in Canada that focused on homelessness, housing, worked on a variety of social change and social justice issues over the years, including, the concept of community psychology. Talk a little bit about your background and a little bit of what got you focused over time in this area of dementia and Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a community psychologist, and I worked on a large randomized control trial in Canada that was a housing program for adults with psychiatric disabilities. And our view, based on some American research, was actually only about, there's 10% of folks who are living on the street that use sort of 50% of the resources in the system. And so rather than graduating people through shelters and halfway houses, we thought that if we actually just reversed the continuum of care and did the opposite of what was being done, we probably would get better outcomes and probably do it more cost effectively. And so we ran this RCT that had an implementation science component. So we were focused on two questions, one of which is, does the intervention work? Yeah. And the second is really focused on under what conditions is it adoptable and sustainable? And so, we were able to show, with a large research team, it was more cost effective. And then we moved it from 5 cities to about 20 in Canada, and we're able to get sort of broad policy change across levels of government, which was super exciting. And then, as you mentioned, I led a human-centered design studio for a number of years. I worked with Davos in the capacity of a consultant there. I, really love the type of academic research that I did in grad school in implementation science. And I think in the Alzheimer's space, my exposure was largely through having 2 grandparents that lived with the disease. And, as a teenager, watching our family go through it and the caregiving and, the family side of it. I think it's a really optimistic time for the field. It's really exciting to see novel treatments and diagnostics. And as an implementation scientist, also know from other areas, including mental health, that when we find really good evidence-based models of care, it tends to be sort of a gap of 15 to 20 years before we see that go to the bedside. And, from my own family's view, that's a long time. That's a couple generations of family members potentially. And so, was just really excited to come into the DAC SP world and run these implementation studies where we're really focused on, when we have really good diagnostics and novel treatments, how do we make sure that they get out of the lab into the real world really, really quickly so patients and families benefit.
Absolutely. And Vaibhav, you're doing your PhD. You're studying the DNA binding domains of transcription factor SP1. You head off to Solera at a very important time in terms of the human genome, working with Craig Venter, who we just profiled a couple months ago on the show. And then you get into a lot of things that sort of bridge the gap between sort of the world of genomics and sort of digital health in terms of wearables, looking at everything from Alzheimer's to depression, multiple sclerosis, and sort of these really interesting technologies, the tech bio world, if you may call it that. Talk a little bit about yourself and a little bit of, again, the sort of the connection that ultimately got you to where you are now.
Thanks. Yeah, you make me really feel good about my past here, and it indeed has been exciting. Yes, you're right. I did start my career off more in the biotech space, working in genomics and bioinformatics before it was called bioinformatics. Spent 5 years sequencing the human genome, assembling it, and also post-genomic work in large-scale proteomics, etc. And then I came into big pharma, first at Lilly and then at J&J. And I have to say that one advantage of being in big pharma is that you get to see a lot of things. And I was able to work across different therapeutic areas, different disease areas in big pharma, working in data sciences and genomics and biomarkers, etc. But about 10 to 15 years ago, the area of neuroscience really caught my attention, right? It really brings together many of the challenges in a very meaningful problem, right? Of course, a lot of the brain diseases are highly inherited. They have a strong genetic component, so there's the whole genes there. But there is, of course, they're also very expressive in terms of their phenotype, right? Brain is a very plastic organ. You use it to behave, you use it to emote, you use it to remember. So there's this huge layer of, memory, cognition, behavior that can be measured now in various ways using digital phenotyping, for example, right? So from a data perspective, it's a very interesting field that links all the way from your genes to your behavior, right through neuroimaging, etc. And it really is a fantastic multimodal problem to work from a data perspective. It also, of course, is a very important problem to work from a societal perspective, from an individual's perspective. And so I really got into it during my days at J&J. Really got to get some insights on on what are the challenges that are really specific to fields like Alzheimer's and dementia, right? Why is more progress being made? Why is industry money going more to, say, oncology and immunology, et cetera? And I think that the work that we are doing at the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative is really designed to address some of those gaps that exist in this field, which are not going to be, where the incentive structure is not already there to fill those gaps organically. And we are trying to step into that space and really make a difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as you were just mentioning, this is much more than a healthcare issue. It has the ability to, again, when you look at some of these numbers and you go to the DAC website, it can shake the social fabrics. It's an economic issue. It's a global security issue. Clearly, if anything's calling for a moonshot, it's Alzheimer's, dementia. Take a little time, and again, tag team on this one as you would. I mean, again, coming at it from both your perspectives, talk about the Davos Alzheimer Collaborative, a little bit about its background and its genesis. And what are one of the big things that stands out to me, and I learned it from the last couple of days of research, is just this amazing number of people that are just never even diagnosed, much less treated in the world. We'll get to that a little later on with some of what you're going to be talking about at the conference. But talk about the collaborative and talk about some of these numbers from both of your perspective of why of anything a super moonshot in this context is really critical here.
For sure. I can definitely give some background on Davos and its genesis, and I'll invite Vaibhav to jump in as well. Full disclosure, I have a 4-month-old and we're sleep training this week, so I'm sure that I'll miss some stuff. The Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative was convened right before the pandemic at the annual World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, and so the World Economic Forum, or WEF, is sort of a forum where the public and private sectors meet. And so there was several templates in the infectious disease space, namely Gavi and CEPI, that were health initiatives of WEF. And they, were impressive because they braided together, policy and national governments in looking at the durability of policy commitments, as well as the efforts of the private sector to try and harmonize those things. And so that for the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, that's one of the sort of key things that we're able to drive on, is those public-private partnerships. And then, there's a number of challenges in the Alzheimer's space that I think Vaibhav and our teams are really working on. So I think one is more about, global discovery of targets and understanding of disease. And the other is, when we are successful in finding novel diagnostics and therapeutics, we know that there's such a significant gap between that discovery and actually getting them embedded in community practice, in clinical practice, that we saw that as a place we could really play. And so there's, philanthropic VCs, as well as obviously industry working on diagnostics and treatments. But as they were successful, there wasn't a group globally looking at, okay, hey, if we built these fast trains and labs, has anyone checked what shape the tracks are in healthcare systems, and are they ready? And so that really has been our focus. And then I'll turn it over to Vaibhav to talk more about his team, as well as top up on anything that I may have missed about the DAC origin story.
Sure.
No, thank you. Thank you, Tim. Yeah. So I head up a program at the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative called the Global Cohorts Program, and I'll tell you a little bit about it and why we think that this is crucial to the field. And obviously, everybody's experience is a little bit colored by what they have done and tried, and et cetera. And like I said, I came to DAC after a long career in the industry where we, tried many, shots on goals in drug development, trying to get drugs through clinical trials to the market. And although, the first drugs have now started coming out and it's an exciting time, it still is an area with a huge unmet need and very fraught and very risky product development program. And fundamentally, I would say, just at a very high level, your best chance of developing novel and good solutions are in those diseases that you understand well from a data perspective, right? If you don't understand the underlying mechanisms and heterogeneity of the disease, it's awfully hard to develop solutions in that space. I would argue that pharmaceutical drug development is one of the most information-intensive areas of product development ever. Behind that pill are like terabytes and terabytes of data. And when I was in the industry, what struck me was that in every other therapeutic area, you would have a clear diagnostic sort of to identify patients for clinical trials. When we were doing some of the early clinical trials in Alzheimer's, later on, we found out that up to 25% of the people in the clinical trial did not even have Alzheimer's pathology. And here we are trying to detect a small difference or a difference between placebo and active arm, right? We did not have good ways to identify people who would be suitable for clinical trials. Every other therapeutic area, we knew how to, stratify the disease, how to subselect patients for certain types of drugs. Whereas in Alzheimer's, it was just, everybody was in the same bucket. Whereas we know that this is a very heterogeneous disease. So essentially, there was no precision approach possible in Alzheimer's at all, which really, if you look at oncology, the reason it has made so much progress in the last decade or two is because now you can really take a precision approach, identify the right patients for the right drugs. No such sort of paradigm exists even today in Alzheimer's. And we also did not know how fast would anybody progress, even if we recruited them into trials. Some people decline very rapidly. Other people, essentially bump along and never decline clinically. And if you stack your trial up with people who are not going to decline, then you are basically looking at an years and years long trial. Right. So all this to say that we did not really understand Alzheimer's disease in its full glory at all, right? I mean, let me just give you one example. And the variability in Alzheimer's is both biological, genetic, as well as environmental. I mean, this disease has a lot of environmental risk factors and comorbidities that varies a lot, right? And we basically had no understanding of either the biological variability, the genetic variability, or the variability due to other stressors and risk factors and resilience factors that are environmental. And I was going to say that, more than, for example, 90% of all GWAS genetic data in Alzheimer's comes from less than 10% of the world's population, right? This is quite an outstanding sort of a startling figure. So what we started doing in the Global Cohorts program was to really democratize Alzheimer's research, really collect data from a diverse set of cohorts around the world, which represented both the genetic diversity as well as the diversity in risk and resilience factors, environmental risk factors, different comorbidities, and et cetera. And we know that Alzheimer's progresses very differently in people, for example, who may have uncontrolled diabetes, or people who may have uncontrolled hyperlipidemia, or people who might be exposed to certain mental health risk factors. So we are looking at all of these factors. We are collecting data from across the globe, and we are bringing it together in a way that we can cross-mine it. And hopefully we will get into some of why what we are doing at DAC is somewhat unique and fills a gap, right? Because there's lots of efforts around collecting data here, there, and everywhere, but we are putting together certain mechanisms and certain processes which we think are clearly filling a gap, a huge data gap, and not just a data gap, but an insights gap, which we think in the long run will basically enable much better both diagnostic and therapeutic product development in this space and innovation in this space.
Excellent. Now that's great because you both mentioned this principle, and I'll repeat it about innovation to the bedside. It takes a long time to innovate, but even this period window, if it's not done right, can take a very long time. But we got to get to Tim on your front, many bedsides and many health systems. Vaibhav, we need to get to many cohorts, many different types of people, or else this doesn't work. And I just wanted to point out, while we don't have him with us today, your founding chairman, Mr. Vredenberg, on a paper that just came out a couple days ago, Nature Review Neurology, Acceptable Performance of Blood Biomarker Test of Amyloid Pathology, major piece of innovation here. With that, Tim, I'll come back to you because let's get into the Health System Preparedness Program. Again, couple of months ago had Phyllis Farrell on. You and her were on this paper from 2023 in terms of, hey, a framework for addressing Alzheimer's disease. Without a frame, we have no aim. We need a framework. And with that being said, love to hand things over to you to introduce the Health Systems Preparedness Program, take us into the Learning Lab, the Early Detection Blueprint, and take your time with this because this is an extremely important piece. And Vaibhav, relax for a little bit and I'll come back to you.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, system preparedness and implementation science can feel very esoteric really quickly, but let me just give you like a really simple example of why this stuff matters. So one of the first recorded randomized control trials happened sort of in the 1600s in the British Navy, where you had a Scottish physician who gets this idea that he's got some sailors with scurvy. He sort of doubts that the like malt and vinegar treatment works well. And he, takes 4 groups of them. One group he does nothing. One group he gives lemons. One group he gives sauerkraut. One group he gives vinegar. And he finds very quickly that lemons are the only thing that really cures scurvy, and they cure it really fast. And so, this is a mercantile economy. Like sailors getting sick is consequential economically. You'd assume like, that's great. This physician learned that the lemon solves scurvy. Like, let's go, let's get the lemons on ships. And, predictably, it took 50 years for that to go from discovery to standard operating procedure. And the reasons for it are not particularly complex or fancy. Like, he published his results in like a 500-page treatise. He didn't train any early adopters. And so people that tried to replicate it would juice the lemons and boil the juice because, space on ships is expensive. That's where cargo goes. Captain Cook was like very famous in those days and had the ear of the Navy, and he really, preferred like a kraut drink or something. And so there's all of these reasons outside of science that really have to do with the economic and social world that got in the way of lemons going quickly. And so I think, in the same way that you can't think of a more simple intervention than a lemon, when we talk about a blood test or a digital cognitive assessment that would dramatically expand access to patients and families of getting a diagnosis of either MCI, mild cognitive impairment, or Alzheimer's quickly and help them both prepare, offset risk, make arrangements for care, choose whether they would like to be part of a clinical trial or treatment. We just see huge barriers to clinical practice actually adopting these tools. And so the first study that we ran in our preparedness framework was really focused on actually just getting cognitive assessments in primary care in the form of a digital cognitive assessment and a blood-based biomarker. And so we used tools that were either had regulatory clearance or were very mature in the regulatory pathway. And we really just looked, we had 19 sites in 12 countries across sites. What are the common themes in an implementation science module of like the drivers of understanding adoption and the barriers to understanding adoption. And so, we've moved on from just a DCA and a blood test to focus on to accurate diagnosis in a follow-up study where we go much further than primary care. And, even though they're global studies, the findings are remarkably similar in the types of barriers that systems face. So, generally, the brain is an organ that we don't talk about much, if at all, in primary care. It's not like metabolic health or like oncology, where, as Vaibhav mentioned, there are diagnostic pathways. And so systems sort of need to stand these things out from scratch. And so, you sort of find this tricky mix of clinician behavior, a policy backdrop, and how systems sort of modulate between those two things. And so you find common challenges around, setting up primary care doctors just to be confident in understanding mild cognitive impairment. You run into issues with sort of back-end IT systems and billing that are quite common that make it very hard for them to practice medicine. And so, even though the contexts in which we're doing our studies are quite different, we see a lot of barriers that are remarkably similar. And so, the thing that we think is really impactful is on the other side of these studies, packaging our learnings into really tangible, we call them blueprints, where we build websites online. We take all of the tools that our site leaders needed to build themselves to run the study. So whether that be, how do you do disclosure of an assessment to a patient, or what should a brain health navigator role look like in your system to make this much easier for clinicians, all of that stuff, just packaging it in one area and sort of harnessing what are the known points where systems are likely to struggle, and how did our systems actually get over those points. And so our goal, of course, to publish peer review articles, but our goal is to really translate the learnings as quickly and as accessibly at no cost as we can, so that we're able to see those proliferate into the field.
Excellent. And I'll come back to you to talk a little bit about some of the poster session, the papers that we're going to be seeing at AAIC. But first, Vaibhav, I'm going to come over to you and now talk a little bit about introducing the Global Cohorts Inclusive Research Program. Again, a major initiative, and again, looking at some of where you went with this, it's not. You're going to a lot of the places one would think, okay, we're going to Africa, Asia, Middle East, but you're also working in the Amazon. You were tapping into ophthalmologists, which again it was obviously in these diseases we think of the neurologist, but obviously the ophthalmologist has a much easier way to sort of track some of the things that are happening in the pathophysiology here. Take a little time to go through the Global Cohort Inclusive Research Program, and then again, I'll ping-pong back and forth as we talk about some of the papers at AAIC.
No, thanks. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And before I get into, you're right, we are in multiple continents already, looking to expand even further. And I will take you through a quick drive of what each of those settings looks like, and what's common and what's a little bit unique in each of those settings. But before I do that, I do want to sort of address this question of, what are some of the things that we are doing in the DAC Global Cohort Program, which we want to make sure that we are not just creating another set of isolated cohort studies, right, of which there are, quite a few going on here and there, but really creating and building towards an asset where the whole is going to be more than the sum of the parts at the end of it, right? And so one of the challenges, and I think Tim, you were talking about it as well, right? How do we create a consistent data set where you can really get insights across the board? And two of the modalities that we are really focusing on are blood-based biomarkers, because we really do think that that's the future. Blood is something that can be a scalable way of assessing this disease, a relatively inexpensive way and a relatively non-invasive way compared to CSF, right? And the other technology that we are really focusing on is digital biomarkers. Both blood and digital, we think, are highly scalable paradigms to understand the disease. And of course, then there's the genetics piece, right? Sure. And so one of the things that we're doing is that we are, as we go around the world, collecting, processing these blood samples, we are doing it in a standardized way with standardized protocols, so that the blood that we collect from all these different Alzheimer's cohorts around the world can really be used to understand, are these blood-based biomarkers really behaving in the same way across the diverse populations that we have, with the same type of cutoffs apply? And I'll come back to this later on. Similarly, what we are doing is that as we are collecting digital sort of diagnostic data, digital health, digital technologies, we are taking the same set of technologies more or less and applying them across the board in all our cohorts around the world. And these relate to speech-based biomarkers, ocular biomarkers from the eye, olfactory biomarkers, and other novel cognitive tests. But we have a common protocol, and to the extent possible, we apply the same protocol, inject the same protocol in different diverse cohorts around the world. And also, it's not just about introducing the same technologies. We are also providing services to curate and clean the data in a consistent way from across our cohorts. And all that is then supposed to come together and comes together in ADDI, which is a great partner for us, Alzheimer's Disease Data Initiative, where from which the data are made accessible to researchers around the world. So we really are trying to kind of not just grow a global cohorts program, but interlink these cohorts in a way to really generate novel insights. And this is something which requires maybe an entity like DAC, which is somewhat of a neutral entity, working with each of our cohort partners around the world, injecting a common protocol around the world, and really creating something where, like I said, the whole can be more than sum of its parts. And I did want to make sure that I mentioned this, because in absence of that, we run the risk of creating one more point effort, one more point effort, one more point effort that does not add up. So with that said, I do want to sort of emphasize that yes, we are in different countries and different continents around the world right now, establishing cohorts and collecting data. We are trying to create some consistency in the type of data collected, how we collect biosamples and how we analyze them. But we are also not overlooking some of the unique advantages and the unique settings that we operate in. And let me give you some good examples. So for example, one of the first programs we started was in Kenya, in Africa. And there what we have done is that we have started a very detailed biomarker study that for the first time will validate all these digital technologies in a completely new population in Kenya. And that will tell us whether these technologies that are being developed all over the world in the West, whether speech-based diagnostics, eye-based diagnostics, olfactory diagnostics, other novel diagnostics, do they work in the Kenyan population, right? Does the polygenic risk score, which was developed in the Western population, does it work in this Kenyan population? And if it does, we have also a larger community cohort in which we will go into the community and apply these technologies in a real world setting so that we know what the scale up looks like. And then from that, hopefully pick people off of clinical trials. But in Kenya, we have a very strong partner in Aga Khan University, where we are able to do this detailed validation study and then scale into the community. And that's a very, very nice and a unique opportunity to bring the world's innovation to this one particular location and generate data that previously has not been generated before. Now, in India, we are taking a slightly different approach. We did not really take this, okay, let's do a detailed validation study, a single study, and then go into a single community. We took advantage, are taking advantage of the fact that there are literally millions and millions of people going through cataract surgery in very high throughput ophthalmology clinics in India. And as you know, that by the time people get cataract surgery, they are getting to be high risk for dementia and cognitive issues. And we have made sort of connections with multiple ophthalmology clinics to insert the same cognitive tests, for example, that were in Kenya, more or less into these ophthalmology clinics to detect people with early cognitive decline and then refer back them to neurologists for confirmation. And we believe that we will be able to generate very large high throughput data sets, including retinal imaging, et cetera. And so this is sort of a slightly different funnel approach, but but the data that we generate will still be combinable with the data elsewhere. In South Korea, another example, we have the benefit of getting into a cohort which is already very highly characterized. In other words, it already has neuroimaging diagnosis. It already has a detailed clinical examination. And there what we are doing is we are collecting blood samples using, again, the same protocol and and collaborating with diagnostics and pharma companies in the US to validate their blood-based biomarkers now in an entirely new population. And so we take advantage of the fact that we already have a well-characterized cohort. In Caribbean, we have a slightly different approach of a very real-world cohort where we are curating and cleaning data and understanding the prevalence of this disease in different Caribbean countries and comparing them to each other, et cetera. In Chile, we have a long north-south country with multiple cohorts where we have the unique opportunity to look at how climate issues, right? Climate change in this long north-south country, different crop patterns, different pesticide use, how that might impact people's cognition and cognitive decline, same issues in Amazonia. And I should point out that now you might think that, okay, well, just randomly we are studying the impact of climate in Chile. How does that sort of gel? No, when we decided that we're going to study the impact of pollution and climate also on Alzheimer's disease and cognition, we also strive to put the same measures in all our cohorts, right? So collect the same pollution data or put the same wristbands to collect sort of silicone bands to collect exposure to neurotoxins so that whatever findings we find in Chile can be compared with findings in Colombia, can be compared with findings in Egypt, for example, another place where we're getting into with a lot of genetic diversity. So we are, as soon as we find something insightful, we try to horizontally smear them across multiple of our global cohorts. Now, I cannot guarantee that it will get into all the cohorts, but we try to get the same measure in all the cohorts that we are working in. And so at a high level, what the thought I want to leave you with is that we have these vertical cohorts emerging in different continents, but we have these strong horizontals where we're collecting the same type of data and same type of outcomes in all these cohorts, and then we interlink them, right? And so going back to sort of this whole notion of how does environmental stressors, local pollutants, et cetera, impact cognition and cognitive decline, we created a whole cross-cohort sort of group of people, and across cohort, we had a huge webinar where everybody, all our cohorts came together and said, let's tackle this problem, hopefully in a consistent way. And these are, by the way, going to be huge drivers. I know we have talked a lot about drug development and diagnostic development. You mentioned earlier in when you were introducing us that these are massive societal problems as well, right? And the fact of the matter is that as societies become more knowledge-based, right, your cognitive capital and your cognition is a very important asset, right? Oh, yeah. That's what allows you to work. And a paper came out recently in Nature which showed that of all the modifiable risk factors, right, in the top 6 that impact some of the networks in the brain that really drive Alzheimer's were air pollution and alcohol consumption and these kinds of modifiable risk factors, right? Yep. So if our global cohorts program can give us insights into how these risk factors contribute to the risk of Alzheimer's disease, that's also going to be a huge impact in ultimately, designing prevention and doing prevention in Alzheimer's. And we don't talk about it enough, but that's another huge sort of area that we hope to influence by collecting data where actually these risk factors are varying, right? I mean, the fact is that people are getting exposed to, uncontrolled diabetes, uncontrolled, heart disease, extreme heat, extreme pollution in those parts of the world, right? And we have to collect data in those parts of the world to really understand the interplay between these risk factors and cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. And so I guess, in summary, I would say that we are generating a large data set that will help developers of diagnostic solutions, developers of therapeutic solutions, in identifying, maybe recruiting people to clinical trials or understanding the disease. But we are also developing some insights at a higher level about what are the risk factors that are really driving both prevalence and progression in this disease. And hopefully that will help us design some customized prevention program. And I use the word hopefully, but we are actually doing something about it. So for example, we have a partnership with Fingers, and which is a major evidence-based prevention study, to customize their program to some of the places where we have the cohorts where we identify the right risk factors, et cetera. So yeah, anyway, I mean, I'm happy to go further into it, but I do want to leave you with the message that we at DAC are taking a somewhat of a consistent approach in creating these cohorts, collecting consistent data across these cohorts around the world, where we think a lot of the variations, the risk factors are, and where we can get some pretty good insight into the disease itself.
Yeah, and clearly, as you're you're getting the genomics, the epigenetics, the social determinants of health, and everything else you were just mentioning. Clearly, your AI machine learning background is going to be extremely useful in digesting all of this information and finding the proper patterns. And I know I think that's awesome. Fiva, I'll come back to you again. Take a little time to rest on that one. We'll get to a couple of the AIC poster sessions. Tim, I want to come back to you now as yeah, because Vaibhav took us on that amazing global virtual road trip there, but you've been on one as well, per the blueprint. And I say the DAC early detection program and its blueprint has an entirely separate website, and we'll put a link to that. But you've been on a road trip as well, Brazil, Jamaica, Japan, Mexico, Scotland. I know there's an interesting story about a van, an Alzheimer's van in Armenia.
Yeah.
Take us into sort of your international journey per the early detection program and some interesting learnings there. And I'm assuming, because one of the main poster sessions is going to be your blueprint for early detection, roadmap for global healthcare systems readiness. How are we doing? Any countries stand out as better than others? What are some of the key learnings you're taking away from your own journey there?
Yeah, for sure. So we ran our initial study on early detection in primary care in 12 countries. And so we did 7 of those sites using a common model where they were doing a digital cognitive assessment and a blood-based biomarker. And the other 12 were run as a grant program where we had health systems globally submit how they would tackle getting increased rates of cognitive assessment in either primary or non-specialist care. And that was, for us, a way of using technology like a digital cognitive assessment in blood that's hugely promising in understanding barriers, but also appreciating that health systems are very diverse, wanting to leave room for local solutions to problems. So you mentioned Armenia, so a country that's hard to move around in. Nodes of care are challenging there, and so they used a van so they were able to physically drive around and do paper-based tests. And so a really unique challenge that in some ways is somewhat lo-fi, but really responds to the challenge of how do you do cognitive screening in that context. Another example, I'm Canadian, I live in Toronto. Our country is incredibly rural. We have very few neurologists. We have not a lot of PET machines. And so actually figuring out how do you find scalable ways where you're able to graduate people, particularly in outside of cities, to neurology quickly is just a real important challenge for us. And so we had a site in Toronto that utilized a ocular scan at a optometrist. And a lot of great things about this. One, most Canadians live pretty close to an optometrist. 2, older adults tend to have relationships with optometrists. They don't have the workflow challenges and load of primary care. And so they were able to collaborate with the Alzheimer's Society in Toronto and sort of figure out a really smart care pathway, which was very interesting. And then we also had in the US and Japan partnerships with community-based pharmacies. So again, in most countries, people live quite close to a community-based pharmacy, more accessible in many cases than primary care, and potentially more flexibility in terms of just capacity than primary care. And so in both sites, they were doing digital cognitive assessments and figuring out how to do the flow through and to formalize care pathways. So very cool to see a diversity of models. I think in general, the thing that we learned across our studies that we're sort of taking into AAIC and is very relevant to the blueprint, when people tend to think about why cognitive assessment in primary care is so challenging, they sort of point to two issues. So one is the confidence, behavior, and motivations of physicians. And the second is policy. And those things are pretty far apart, right? Like one is sort of a systems thing, it's social and economic. The other thing is sort of what's going on inside a physician. And I would not discount that those are really important areas that explain why cognitive assessment are so difficult to do in primary care. But it also glosses over that individual health systems tend to have to metabolize policy, and that flows through to clinicians. And so globally, clinicians and primary care docs are incented to work in the practice. They're not incented or paid to work on the practice. And the challenge that we saw is you need a primary care leader who can, marshal changes to procurement or billing codes or clinical workflow or clinic infrastructure in order for physicians to actually be able to do tests. And so if you don't fund that, it's really challenging for physicians to stand these programs up in sustainable and scalable ways. And there's a lot of really fantastic training and education that exists for clinicians. But if we don't get really good at the operational components of these programs and the kind of boring stuff of billing codes and procurement and IT setup and health records, it becomes so hard for a really busy physician to do this stuff. I mean, if you're a physician and you're doing an assessment and right in your EMR are the steps, it's reimbursable, you're not needing to think about it, and it's clear where you send a patient in your clinical decision-making, it's not so hard to do this stuff. If you're a clinician and you don't know how to bill it, you don't know how to disclose it, you're not sure which test you should use, or you need a medical assistant to actually physically put it in a record, those are all very, very good reasons for someone to not do this. And so we think that a combination of education, but also operational learning about how do you start these programs in a systematic way, run the right change management, and monitor for failure and remediation. We really saw those factors as being important across sites in terms of who got to high quality programs with good outcomes and high patient pull through. And so the blueprint is really designed to harness all of the hard fought learnings from our site leaders into a really accessible resource. So we were the facilitator of that blueprint. We co-designed it with our site leaders. We brought them together in person a number of times during the study. We used a human-centered design partner to prototype a lot of bad first drafts of it before we sort of authored it and coded it. And certainly at AAIC, that blueprint will be something that we're presenting on. I think the other thing, our sites and us as a central group are starting to also report on some of the barriers and facilitators to doing cognitive assessment in primary care. And so, we have a featured research session on that, where we're going to talk to 6 or so of our site leaders and focus on the sustainability phase of their programs. And we're thrilled to see about 10 of our sites having a combination of posters and research sessions there as well. And they'll be reporting on their experience with implementation and some of the outcomes of their individual program as well. So I think this data will be very interesting to people because it's implementation data. It's really focused on what happened in the real world in relatively uncontrolled settings when we try to use these tools. And so I think it's a nice complement to some of the validation data that people would be familiar with. So we're very excited for the conference and all of the hard work that our partners have put in to get us here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A couple of your, there's a bunch of teams, sort of underneath the Global Cohort umbrella. I thought maybe you could touch on a couple of them. I mean, I see that there's a few posters you're going to be involved in per this group at Southern Columbia University, Dr. Hernandez and Bonilla Santos talking about biomarkers in older adults in Southern Columbia, and then a couple really interesting ones. And I guess this is This is a topic that I guess it doesn't fit, per specific biomarker drug development, but Dr. Edna Basire in Kenya, doing a lot of interesting work in terms of the caregiver component here. And this is something I think gets glossed over a little too much. We hear about the sort of the unpaid caregiver issue a lot, but talk a little bit about this as well, because I think this is another topic that we should focus on a little more. What's going to be discussed there? If you can give us a little preview as well.
Yeah, happy to. And I do want to start by saying that, we at DAC are a great team, and obviously the healthcare systems preparedness work is historically kind of more advanced at this point of time. The global cohorts program, as anybody who has done R&D work knows, has slightly longer timelines. We have spent much of 23 and 24 really establishing our first wave of cohorts, and that included a lot of sort of legal contracting work, getting ethics approval, getting the data sort of localization, security, and privacy issues sorted out. And now, a lot of the data collection is beginning, and data will continue to be collected, harmonized, and clean. And so we think that a lot of the sort of the insight generation from the data, like you said, the whole AI, ML, and cross analyses, et cetera, will start on 2025 onwards. And so we really hope to push on and sort of report a lot more results from the data starting next year. And in fact, we are putting together a DAC scholars program specifically designed to recruit scholars from around the world that will work on these integrated data sets for insight generation. So I do want to say that. The other thing I want to say, just philosophically, is that the way we run our global cohorts program is very federated and decentralized. So the individual PIs, the cohorts, always continue to own the data, and they continue to drive some of the local research because we want to do local capacity building. So a lot of the publications that come out of the global cohorts program will not necessarily be labeled as DAC global cohort publication, but will be our kind of network of cohorts publishing through their independent channels, and then of course working together as well. So those are a couple of things I did want to mention. So next year onwards, I think we will be we'll have a higher throughput in terms of communications and conferences. But having said that, even now in this AAIC and then also in the DAC Nature Dementia Conference in September in Nairobi, the cohorts program will be presenting some very interesting work related to some of the early insights from, say, speech-based biomarkers that we are already starting to get from Kenya. But the one you pointed out, the one that Edna, our dear colleague, is working on, is in fact a very important component. So when we start cohort programs around the world, we stage it in many ways. There is a pilot phase, then an expansion phase. But one of the things that we are doing, which I think is unique, is that, and this is led by our colleagues in Kenya, is that we are also doing clinical anthropology-driven ethnographic studies. We want to not just go there and deploy technology and collect blood and assess cognition and all that to the data collection. We want to also locally understand what are people's attitudes and perception to Alzheimer's and cognitive decline and dementia, right? Not just patients themselves, but also their family members and caregivers. And the reason why this is important is that, as you might imagine, that in different parts around the world, this disease is perceived very differently, right? In some places, it is just considered to be normal aging, right? Hey, if you're getting forgetful, you're losing memory, that's just old age, right? Or they don't really take the disease seriously until you start showing neuropsychiatric symptoms, at which point of time it gets associated with a lot of stigma, right? So it's kind of important to understand in a systematic way, how do people perceive the disease? What is their attitude to the disease? Do they even see it as a disease, right? If they do see it as a disease, then what's the best way for them to participate in data sort of, donation in data trials or intervention trials? And the reason for collecting this kind of information is not to sort of say what's not possible, but to design better communication, to better adapt the tools that we are developing to such that we can actually get engagement from the community and collect long-term sustainable data. And so what Edna is sort of presenting is part of that work, part of her work that is doing essentially clinical anthropology studies to understand attitudes and barriers and facilitators to addressing Alzheimer's disease, say, in that community. But I want to go back to the point I made about interlinking. We're going to lift the same protocols that Edna is deploying in Kenya and also deploy them in Chile and in Colombia and in other countries, in Egypt potentially, so that we can also start getting a global view of how the attitudes towards this disease changes, from region to region and culture to culture, again, to sort of better design interventions or to better design data collection. One small example I'd give you is that, for the longest time when we were getting into the Kenya protocols, we said, hey, if you want to go into the community, collecting blood samples is going to be awfully hard. Imagine, vans, bumping along rural Kenyan roads. And, let's go with saliva sample collection. Or even like, if you want to get at some of the historical sort of cortisol-driven biomarkers of stress, etc., can we get hair samples as well? And it turns out that when we started doing some of the interviewing, people had more reservations about giving saliva and hair than they had about blood for some local cultural reasons, amongst other things, right? And our point was not to get this insight to say, let's not collect saliva or let's not collect, hair, but to say, how do we better communicate why we need these things, right? What are we going to do with it, etc. So it really helps us design our protocols better. But more importantly, it really gives us a very clear understanding of how the disease is perceived in the local communities and how best to sort of design, either prevention studies or intervention studies. So that in a nutshell is some of the posters that are being presented. More will be presented in the Nature DAC Dementia Conference in Nairobi, and in 2025 onwards, starting in February in New Orleans in the International Conference of Neuropsychology, we are going to have a big event there, presenting more output from our global cohorts program. So like Tim said, that a part of what we do at DAC is not just doing work, right? We have to communicate this work, and I guess conferences is a crucial way to do it, as are these podcasts.
For sure. I think also, I mean, a lot of what Vaibhav was talking about, whether it be common protocols for blood or sort of the ethnographic research, it shows up so strongly in real world health systems. So for example, because most blood tests have used a relatively narrow range of patients to validate on, you get countries like Mexico, where for the population ApoE may express differently, or in the US, we have a site in New York City and Harlem, and because they're serving a majority Black population, actually setting the cutoffs for the blood test is really challenging because it's not the population the tests were validated on. And then, additionally, we have countries like Jamaica, and they had to have a really strong game in the community in terms of going to the places where people already were to do these tests, rather than just waiting for them to come into the clinics. And then things like, the accent on an iPad when you're doing a digital cognitive assessment, having to go back and redo development cycles so people can actually understand it. So we really see this stuff show up, and I'm so impressed with the work that Vaibhav is doing, but also really, really responds to a lot of the downstream pain points we see in the field.
While I have both of you, last year, again, the founding chairman of the organization, Mr. Reidenberg, published a piece in the Lancet about, if we're going to have health for all, we have to have an integrated commitment to healthy aging. And this topic of healthy aging, health span, whatever you want to call it, has become extremely important. It's been a sort of a hot topic for us the last couple of years. From both your perspectives, Vaibhav, from the sort of the integrated package that you're talking about in terms of genomics and epigenetics and social determinants of health, Tim, from your angle, and some of what you've been involved in terms of social justice. We talk about ageism as the ism that sort of not a lot of people care about that one, and we really should, because demographics all around this little blue marble of Harris are changing dramatically, especially where we're going 2050, 2060. Say a few words, both of you, if you would, about healthy aging and sort of the importance to, because all of these, whether we're talking about Alzheimer's, cancers, heart disease, it all comes back to the fact that, it's connected to this underlying process of aging. Vaibhav, you mentioned a little bit about that when you were talking about just before with the with some of your poster sessions, but take a little time, if you would, while we have you, to just talk about this from the context of healthy aging from your own
Yeah,
perspective.
maybe I'm happy to go first on this. I do think that you're hitting upon something which is actually quite important. I mean, there was also that the famous Lancet study which said that 40% of all dementia cases are due to preventable and modifiable risk factors, and could in principle be prevented, right? And I think that if you take I think in West, quite frankly, we don't approach prevention right. We sort of tend to be more enamored by expensive treatments for late stage or later stage disease, right? And spend a lot of money. And I think that there is an opportunity to potentially rethink prevention from a global perspective. And I think that in a lot of particularly in low and middle income countries with relatively young populations, but with very high prevalence of risk factors, right? Midlife risk factors, like diabetes and pollution and things like that. Specific air pollution, uncontrolled pesticides use. There you can draw up a list of 10 to 12 different modifiable risk factors that are actually driving a lot of risk for cognitive decline and eventual dementia. And there is an opportunity to really go in with a prevention paradigm. But for that to happen, we really need to collect the data, both from a scientific perspective to really understand what risk factors are really driving the risk in that local population, but also from a policy perspective, right? I think that it needs to be shown that in a cost-effective way, you can modify these risk factors and actually derive some benefit, right? And this is not an easy game to play, but tying sort of risk factor modification to outcomes and to sort of pair relevant outcomes, because a lot of these countries, people are saying we're already doing everything we can to reduce obesity and diabetes. Don't tell me that reducing this is going to reduce risk for dementia, but if you actually target the right at-risk population, which are at imminent risk for cognitive decline, right, through clever genetics and all of that, then I think you can get immediate benefit by reducing and mitigating some risk factors in this population where it may be economically viable to actually bring these interventions. And I think that all I can say right now is that in the Global Cohorts program and in DAC as a whole, we want to be able to collect some of these data to show that prevention is possible and viable in certain subpopulations, and then hopefully even help recruit people for these non-pharmacological prevention studies. And one last thing I would say is that in many of the places where we would collect data, it's going to be through community health workers going into people's homes. Okay. As soon as you do that, you're actually exposed to all age ranges in that home, right? The young mother who is, expecting a child, maybe, the grandparents and the young kids. So we do have an opportunity to collect, across the lifespan, focus on some of the more high risk sort of, parts of your lifespan, etc. And so I think it's a very important point you make. And we definitely see enabling prevention studies and collecting data to make the case for prevention as one of the important medium to long-term goals for both the Global Cohorts program, but Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative in general.
Awesome.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I agree with everything Vaibhav said, and I think his lab is poised to really understand this stuff very well in global populations. I think from a system preparedness point of view, it's hard to imagine doing that stuff well in terms of prevention not being, quite utilizing precision medicine. And so actually figuring out how do you get biomarkers in routine practice in a lot of different settings is really key. And so, well, nearer term, there certainly are evidence-based programs like Fingers. We would hope to see more of them. And I think, the advantage of having blood and digital cognitive assessments and voice and eyes and so forth embedded in systems is that we'll be able to move much quicker as that evidence becomes available and as those interventions become available.
Let me give you like a hypothetical case. What if there was a blood-based biosignature of brain aging where you could immediately tell that, yes, by making this life intervention change, right? Whether it's lifestyle intervention or some other, cognitive brain training or whatever it is, I'm actually reducing the risk of cognitive decline here and now, right? And that's reflected in my brain aging blood biosignature. Now, this may sound a little futuristic, but the way we are collecting blood samples across the board, we have measures of brain age gap and brain aging. Can we actually get a peripheral biosignature of brain aging, which is in fact responsive to risk reduction, right? And because part of the name of the game in prevention is engaging the population, right? People are very unwilling to pay for or do behavior change for something that may happen to them in the future. Right. But if you can tell them that, listen, something is improving now, and they believe that this, whatever this is actually tied to my risk, right? Then I think it becomes a very different game. So those are, from a scientific perspective, some of the things to pursue. The good news is I remember when we were at J&J, we did kind of a big kind of commercial study to really understand if there was a way to play in the brain health and prevention space. The good news is that we found out that people were extremely concerned about their brain health and cognitive decline. They just didn't know what to do about it. They see brain as more of a black box, right? But so so there is obviously the challenge, but the opportunity is that if you can get people to engage with their brain health, right? See it as another organ. See how you have maybe we had this concept of a brain health score. Maybe are you living a brain healthy lifestyle, right? Are you sleeping well? Are you socially connected? Are you physically active, etc.? Are you eating some brain healthy foods? Well, it turns out most of this stuff can now be measured digitally, and you can track it, and you can engage people with their brain health. Maybe then show that through a blood-based biosignature, when you sort of live a brain healthy lifestyle, improve your brain health score, which is dynamically calculated automatically, your brain health blood biosignature improves. Maybe this is all people need to latch on to and say, you know what, I'm going to do something about my brain health. And people are interested in it, concerned about it, especially if there is a family history, etc. And so you can, target certain subpopulations. I think all this is possible, but I don't know right now who has the incentive, the financial incentive to develop such solutions. It's not easy to really get paid for developing these kinds of solutions. And so I think all we can do in entities like DAC is at least make the case by generating the right data, etc., so that somebody can maybe take that lead and eventually make some sustainable and viable solutions in this space.
Gentlemen, while we have you, I really wish you a great conference. Again, it's coming up in a couple of days. Final messages from both of you. Anything that we didn't touch on, anything that I missed that you want to mention on our way out, as again, coming from both of your perspectives and leading this amazing Moonshot initiative. Please, both of you, Tim, take the floor, and then we'll have our wrap up.
For sure. So I think generally this is a really optimistic time in the field. Like, we have just seen a ton of progress over the last decade that's accelerated over the last 3 or 4 years. And so, we think about system preparedness all the time. It's our beat. We're obsessed with it. We think about it a lot. I think that the really interesting stuff that people will see in the data in our studies is the challenges to getting this stuff in real world practice are really solvable challenges. They're things that our systems have already figured out, who have figured out really smart solves. And if they go and engage with the data that they're going to see a lot of really good ideas. And so, I think there are for sure a lot of challenges and a lot of ground to cover, but I am always blown away by the innovation of our partners and the things that they figure out and solve in the field. And so I'm just really looking forward to people at the conference getting to have a look at the really smart solutions that our partners have figured out in their local contexts.
Yeah, I guess I agree with everything Tim said, and I think it is an exciting time right now. The first, disease-modifying therapies are starting to be approved, and I think this is also a very opportune time in Alzheimer's disease research to really make sure that the solutions that are developed, in an inclusive way for the broader population. That data and insights from the broader population are driving the solution development, whether it is diagnostics, therapeutics, or prevention solutions. This will make sure that maximum people across the globe benefit from these solutions. We already talked about the fact that this is not just a disease that affects the individual. This is a disease that affects the family, the society, national economies as a whole. And so I think that this is a particular opportunity to make sure that we democratize research and development in brain health and dementia and cognitive decline in a way that we really, develop scalable and generalizable solutions. And now that there is more attention being given to this field, now is the right time for us to really, push forward these initiatives and make sure that they get their fair share of resourcing and attention.
Absolutely. Yeah, and again, as I mentioned in the intro to the show, whether we're talking about COVID or malaria, or we touch on HIV/AIDS and the PEPFAR program, with the moonshot mentality and the right resources, we can get quite a bit done. So I'm excited for you both. I'm excited for the organization. I hope you have a great conference. Again, for everybody that is going to be listening to this episode of our show across the podcast networks, or watching on our YouTube channel. Again, you've been listening to Dr. Tim MacLeod, Director of Systems Preparedness, and Dr. Vaibhav Narayan, Executive Vice President, Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative, ultimately pioneering potential cures for Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Vaibhav, Tim, I really want to thank you both for taking this large amount of time out of your schedule to come talk to us, educate us on what you're up to. Obviously, thank you for everything you're doing here and around the world. And again, as we like to say on our show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow for millions of people out there and their caregivers as well. Really a great story, and wishing you both the best with the programs as you move forward.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much, Ira.
Great having you both.